Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
and me, Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
Our featured guest today is Ben Robinson. Ben Robinson is a poet, musician, and librarian. His most recent publication is Without Form from the Blasted Tree and Knife, Fork, Book. He's only ever lived in Hamilton, Ontario on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. His first book is The Book of Benjamin from Palimpsest Press. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you so much for having me.
As we mentioned in the introduction, you are a librarian as well as a writer. So what's your library specialty and how do you think this work connects with your writing?
It's a good question. I work in the public library. I'm trained as a librarian, but right now I'm working sort of part-time as a clerk. I got young children and it gives me time to do things like work on books, which is, it's nice to have that balance. As far as how it shapes my writing, I think in this book, I see some of that cataloging, right? Some of the, obviously, the left-hand pages of the book, the recto pages, they are documenting all of these other Ben Robinsons. And so for about 9 months to a year, I set a Google alert on my name and all the material that came through, I assembled in this Word document. And I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with it, but I think there's something of that impulse, right, of documenting, of archiving information that feels akin to the library. I think that's maybe the most obvious way in this book that it came in.
And what kind of writing stimulates your own writing? Books that may have crossed your path on the desk there.
Well, I think for this book in particular, Anne Carson's Knox is sort of the, I think at the worst of times, this book feels to me like a cover song of Anne Carson's Knox. There was this this band in the 90s. I grew up in the United Church and they were called the Apologetics. And they would do you maybe know about this. They did cover songs. They sort of Christianized secular music. It's messy theologically, ethically. But I think at the worst of times, this book feels like an apologetics cover of Anne Carson's Knox, the Christianized version of it. But her approach to many things, to grief, right? She's thinking through the loss of her brother, who was an adult, but she's dealing with that lacuna, right? Everything that we don't know. And she's written a book about absence with Knox, and I think that's what this book had to be. I didn't have a whole lot of information there because my sister was not an adult when she passed. There was not that, there were no facts. There were very, very few facts to draw on, and so it was necessarily going to be about what I didn't know. And so she was an excellent example of that. And even in terms of structure, right? Knox uses a similar page and page facing or verso and recto structure where Carson is sort of going through, slowly translating Catullus one word at a time. And so on the left-hand pages, you have, the one word from the Catullus poem. And then Carson is going through and looking at every possible contextual meaning of that word. And so that, it gave me confidence that I could have a book that was doing multiple things at once, or that was kind of arguing with itself across the spine in a way.
So you've started to touch on this a little bit with, Anne Carson's Knox. In general, how does your music connect to your writing? And what kind of music do you generally work in as a musician?
Well, I sort of come to poetry through music, which is maybe not uncommon for young people, right? lyrics, get them into things. Leonard Cohen was one of those transitional figures for me, and maybe the transitional figure, right? Someone who came up in poetry and sort of made the opposite transition that I sort of made. I've gone from music into poetry, but it brought that awareness of lyrics, of lyrical thinking in a way. And so I think by hanging around musicians, that was my introduction into creative life too, right? To see people who were daring or who decided that this is what they wanted their life to look like. I came up in sort of like folk and country among that like banjo revival folk music, you know, a couple years ago. So I was playing that kind of stuff. Lately, I've gravitated towards the pedal steel guitar. So that was at first I was interested in playing maybe more folk country Americana on that, but I've come to I'm interested in pushing the limits of that instrument, and I think part of that is alongside this literary impulse. You know, I'm interested in sort of avant-garde techniques, not solely or not maybe purely, but how do you translate that? You know, the music feeds the writing and the writing feeds back into the music. And I think being a pedal steel player in Hamilton, Ontario, Daniel Lanois is unavoidable, right? And he has done so much to push people's understanding of that instrument and what it's capable of. And so, yeah, you can't help but play out of that history or out of the shadow of Lanois on that instrument.
So as we were looking through this book, we were thinking this is a time that we need to be a video format. The Book of Benjamin has a very unique format in its subject matter as theme and variations on the name of Ben, Benjamin, Ben Robinson. Alternate pages have different formats. Would you like to describe the different formats so that I don't have to?
Yeah. So, I mean, this has been the thing with reading from it, right? I think when you see it visually, right, like you're saying, video would be so helpful here. When you see it visually, I think it makes its own intuitive sense. But before each reading, I've had to figure out, okay, how can I set this up as concisely as possible? But basically, the idea is that on the left-hand pages, on the rectos, I've got that Google Alert material, the appropriated material from the internet about all of these other Ben Robinsons. Sort of across time and across place. And those have been compiled into this sort of long, I think about it as like a genealogical column. So the book is very biblical, and it's almost got this feeling of, you know, in the Hebrew Bible where they're listing begat, 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 so-and-so begat. And instead of, you know, being generations, it's all of these Benjamin Robinsons coming together. And then on the right-hand pages, we have maybe more, some of them are personal considerations, but there may be more lyrical considerations of the name, and a bit more, I would say, I was going to say linear. I don't know that they're necessarily linear because they're jumping between the present and my past and sort of biblical narrative as well. But yeah, those are the two main pieces that you have. And then there's some images that interrupt the text as well. And so those are sort of addressed in the text itself, but what they are, they're date stamps from family photos. So in one of the pages, I get into it and sort of explain that around the time of my sister's passing, she was stillborn. We had extensive documentation of my life, of my childhood, of my infanthood. You know, monthly, weekly, there are these photos that you see in the albums, and then it's very telling. You get to the 6 months around the passing of my sister, and there's no more images. And so it's talking about Carson and Lacuna and writing into absence, and this became, you know, an important symbol for that. I went to these family photo albums, not knowing exactly what I would find, hoping that there might be an image, you know, a singular photograph that I could write towards, and then to go there and to realize, okay, there's nothing. Felt like a dead end at first, you know, to say I was hoping to find something concrete to write towards. But I think with time and with reflection and going back to writers like Carson, realizing, okay, the absence itself is telling here. It is maybe the more powerful or more useful image. And so those, just the timestamps, right, to give a sense of that gap, they sort of break up in maybe 10 or 12 page chunks. They are interspersed through the text. And that was Jim Johnstone, my editor's idea. I had brought him the book and sort of told him he was interested in it, but his one caveat or his one suggestion was that we try to make it a little more multimedia. And would I be interested in bringing in images? And I wasn't opposed to it on principle. I wasn't exactly sure what that would look like. And we played with a bunch of stuff. I scanned a bunch of things from our family archive, but there was something about those texts and even the texture of them, right? It's such a particular era of family photography or amateur photography where you see the date burned into the corner of all of those images. And so there was something that captured both the time, right? To say that like, okay, this is a story that is happening in a very particular section of the 90s, that keyed you into that quite quickly, I found, with the texture of the photos. It linked back to the cover image, which is maybe the only image that we get. You don't even get the full thing, but that we see a person in. And then it also spoke to that sort of gap and illustrated that page that's about the family photo albums.
The writing on the right-hand side of the pages is a blend of poetry, prose, research, and other reflection. Why was it important to combine these effects?
Yeah, I don't think I knew why at first, or even that it was conscious, what I started with, like I said, was the Google alerts, right? And I wasn't sure what was going to happen. And so this was definitely a case of writing from not knowing, writing from a place of inquiry or experimentation. And so I think there was some pull with that material to see, look, here are all these people who have the same name as me. That aspect of defamiliarization, depersonalization. But I think alone, I have a hard time with purely conceptual projects. I think once I get the idea, you get it a couple of pages in and then I sort of lose interest. And so I wanted there to be some tension, some friction there, right? And so to have the conceptual writing playing off against something that's more lyrical or more personal, it brought that sort of necessary friction, or it helped it to cohere a little more. And I think it was destabilizing, at least for me as a reader and as the writer of it, to have you keep with it, because as soon as you get comfortable in a certain mode, I was trying to sort of pivot to the next one.
Meditating on a name like Benjamin naturally brings in associations with all kinds of historical texts and religious texts, especially in the Jewish and Christian faiths. You bring a non-judgmental approach to these, but you also deal with them quite objectively. What made it important to bring these topics into the work?
Well, I'm glad you feel it's objective. That was like a struggle, how to, even beyond this book, right? I think in some ways, this book has been a reckoning for me with these stories that I've grown up with, personal stories, but also these biblical stories that have shaped me as much as family history has. And so now to come back to them as an adult and to say, okay, what is really happening here? What is the relationship between these people? People who engage with these stories or have engaged with these stories have particular understandings of them. There are common understandings, right? Like this story of the binding of Isaac. Isaac or Jacob? The binding of Isaac. And the patriarchs kind of blur together in my mind after having written this. But the binding is so important, right? Because I think there's a common Christian understanding that, like, look, this is a test of faith. And sure, maybe it's harrowing that he was asked to sacrifice his son. And then to come back to that story within the context of my family history, of even the etymology of Benjamin. Benjamin is named by his mother as she sort of takes her last breath, and she dies in childbirth. And Benjamin, is son of my mourning or son of my sorrow. And so there's all of this context of child loss or trauma in birth. And so then to come back and to look at the story of the sacrifice of Isaac is so much more harrowing. And it made me see it in a new way, right? It makes you see it from Isaac's perspective. And again, to speak of that absence, right? I looked at the end of the story. Okay, so this happens, and there's all of this lead up, and there's all of this consideration of or explication of them going up the mountain and him being bound, and then it just kind of cuts off, and it says, Abraham went and lived his life, and no mention of what this might have done to Isaac or how it shaped his psyche and all of these things. Yeah, but I think I wanted to consider the name too in a way that just wasn't only about me and my connection to it. I think part of that too is being a certain kind of white person, and thinking about feeling divorced from a particular tradition, right? Coming up in this sort of like vacuum, this void of whiteness, where I don't really have a particular culture. I'm not really keyed into inheritance and trying to peel that back a little bit and to say, for me, this name for a long time felt like an arbitrary marker, right? People have these names, and who knows how they're chosen. And so it was a way to go back and to give some context to it, to give some history to it, and try to reckon with parts of it that I'd never really considered before.
As with the biblical Benjamin, siblings, you and your brother especially, feature strongly. As with many poetical and fiction works, you also feature parents, but siblings can be a unique aspect. Are these sections memoir, or are they touched with fiction?
Well, I think they're memoir. It's an interesting consideration in writing it too, right? Like, I really admire people who can bring that fictional element into it. That wasn't an impulse I had till closer to the end. The stuff with my brother is pretty true to at least how I remember it, if not how it happened. And I think a lot of this stuff is memory. There are some of my earliest memories, right? Like the stuff with my brother sort of walking out the front door. I wouldn't have been more than 6 or 7. And I've talked to my parents a little bit to try to reconstruct some of this. And it's been interesting. I tried to do it beforehand, because sometimes when you publish things, people see it or your family see it and they say, well, that's not really how it happened. So I was trying to be diligent, like if anyone's got any, fact checking to do, please do it now before it goes to print and we can't make any more changes. I guess that was also complicated by the fact that I wrote a lot of this through the pandemic, when I wasn't really seeing my parents. And so we had talked a bit about this family history, but I had questions, and not questions that I really wanted to ask over the phone or, from the end of the driveway, or any of these things that we were, any of these ways that we were connecting through, social distanced times. And so I had written most of the book anyway, and then was really hoping for a time that I could sit down with my parents in a way that wasn't rushed, or wasn't where we could connect as closely as possible. And so I eventually did get to sit down with them and sort of, interview makes it sound very formal and callous, but to ask them some very particular questions, both about things that I didn't know about, that I had no idea about, and things that I wanted to clarify, given that I was 4 or 5 or 6 for some of these stories.
The left-hand page text provides not only a reflection of grief, but also a bit of comic relief, which includes rather a lot of references to British Premier League football, soccer. Was that another purpose of this section, to bring a bit of lightness to the text, do you think?
I think so. I'm glad you feel that way. I think people don't necessarily know how to respond to this when I'm reading it out loud. I've done a couple of readings with the launch of it. And so I'm always glad to hear people laughing, that feel confident enough in their interpretation of the text that they're not, I don't know, I think it's funny. I agree. And so I'm glad that people can participate in that as well. Yeah, I think that's definitely that was definitely in there. You know, these pieces they came in one by one. And so now they're this big mass and they're all together. But it really did feel like keeping tabs on these people. And so, you know, I see their names just in passing in the news, like Burton Albion FC chairman Benjamin Robinson, right? Yeah, and have developed some feeling of fondness for them, maybe. It's funny who you encounter, and the humor is definitely useful during the reading because I think it is this book that it's difficult to go to that place consecutive nights, right? To get up and to read about this thing that's some of the hardest things that have ever happened to my family. And so, yeah, it is a useful interruption or, you know, have that variety of tone for sure.
Why was it important to quote Mary Kim Arnold? Maybe I want there to be more of a story than there is. What do you
Mm.
think that means to you as the author and for your own work? Yeah.
Well, I think Mary Kim Arnold's book in general was really useful for me. Litany for the Long Moment. She was adopted and she's thinking through her own history, right? She's going back to the archive as well. It's a book with Essay Press, which was their books were really important to me through the writing of this as well. They have this very unique publishing program, right? They're nonfiction, they're hybrid, they're operating in this the meeting of many genres. They have people bringing fiction into memoir and poetry into memoir, and yeah, there's this melding. And Mary Kim Arnold's had a very documentary approach, and so she brought in photographs and adoption forms and all of these things that were helpful for me in considering what belonged in this book, how wide the envelope could be for this book, the kind of things that could rightly be in there. I think the quote became really helpful toward the end of writing this book. And the piece that you're speaking about, Kim, comes about 2/3 of the way through when we've had this structure where there's the columns of Benjamin texts on the left hand and these sort of smaller 2 or 3 paragraph prose, poem, reflections on the right hand. And there are these sentences that run across the left page and all the way onto the right page. And so there was something visually about disrupting that established structure, right? We were talking before about the need to maintain that tension or to have a variation in form to keep things engaging. And so I think flipping through it, even just in PDF, right, seeing it in spreads, and the shape just was too constant. And I felt the need to break that up with something. And the sentence across the full 2 pages, as much of a pain as it might have been for the typesetter, felt useful for that. And I think Mary Kim Arnold captured really succinctly some of my concerns about the whole concept of this book, right? To get to the end and to think, well, what if I'm just reading too much into all of this? I read a great book that I am, of course, forgetting the author of now, but it's an investigation of etymology and how poets use etymology. And I mean, it touches on Carson again. She's a big one, but it's a very interesting, as academic. So I mostly read the intro. The intro was really useful for me, which I have a bad habit of. But he's sort of looking at, how poets engage with etymology. And so that raised some questions for me in terms of, well, am I using the most accurate etymology of this name? And if I have the meaning of the name wrong, right? This whole book sort of turns on the idea that Benjamin is named son of my morning. And so in some of my research toward the end, I realized that there were maybe alternate, maybe more accurate translations of this name that really didn't have much to do with suffering or mourning or sorrow. Yeah, and so what would that mean for my book, right? It was this real moment of feeling like, okay, maybe this project is all for naught. Maybe the book just falls apart if I've been misreading this, the etymology of the name. And so Mary Kim Arnold, right, is speaking maybe my worst fears about this book. And I think at the same time, I was also thinking of this Robert Haas quote, the great American California poet Robert Haas, where he talks about, I guess in his workshops, not that I have been in Robert Haas's workshop, but the idea is to put the problem into the poem, right? And so for me, that looked like bringing this fear into the book and to sort of handing that to the reader and saying, okay, maybe this book isn't necessarily about presenting a clear and confident statement about etymology and fate and coincidence and any of these things, and saying that, like, look, names literally and directly influence our lives, but to present all of the evidence, even the doubts, and to leave it up to the reader to sort of draw their conclusion about how well it all coheres.
So, we're curious about what the reaction to the book has been so far, and in particular, have your library patrons read the book?
Yes, this was the question, right? The last sort of read through that I did of the book was, okay, I need to read through this with some of our regular patrons in mind. Am I comfortable with putting, is there anything in here that I'm not comfortable with? A person that I see daily that you have some kind of connection with, right? It's a professional connection, but it's also a customer service connection in a way. So I have to speak and engage in a certain way at work. And so if people who I have that kind of relationship with have access to these stories about me, what is that going to be like going into work, sitting on the reference desk, where if people want to chat, it's not always easy to get away from uncomfortable conversations. And so that was the last read through, was like, okay, who is there anything in here that I don't want people at work to know, or less my colleagues and more people coming in. I mean, we have many lovely patrons, but you can end up in some interesting conversations. So I wanted to be sure I wasn't giving ammunition for that kind of thing. The library, these things move slow, right? The purchasing, so it's still on order at work. So we'll see who gets a hold of it. We have a little shelf of local reads now, so I'm sure it will end up on there at some point, and it will be interesting. Yeah, I have this thing that feels like a part of my body or myself or something, sort of in the room. And I don't know, I can imagine watching someone sort of consider it, not even knowing that I'm standing close by them, right? We have book clubs sometimes in the branch, and it's been interesting because sometimes they're reading books of people that you're connected to or that you're friends with, right? Gary Barwin, who wrote one of the blurbs for this book, obviously has had some great success with his novels, and they've become book club favorites at our branch. And it's been very interesting to hear some of the discussions of his books, from 6 feet away on the reference desk. So I'm not sure that this will be a book club book necessarily, but yeah, it did cross my mind of, okay, how is this going to translate into this other part of my life? I mean, in terms of reception, I think family was the thing that I was most concerned about, right? This is a book that is about me, but in many ways is about a story that happened before I was born, or when I was quite young and not conscious of it. It's my parents' story in many ways, and so I wanted them to be okay with what's in this book. Both been so great about it, and yeah, I think in some ways very grateful, that we have this family history out there now, that it's been documented. Yeah, so that's been really meaningful to have that reception. It's been a slow roll too. I mean, the book came out officially in the middle of October, but they started shipping them out as orders came in August. And so I would say, maybe once a week I get a text from someone or an email with their experience of the book. So it's been nice to have that sort of trickle in as it makes its way out into the world. It's an interesting thing to consider how a book like this, right, that doesn't come out with a bang and fireworks, but maybe sort of slowly, meeting its readers one by one. It's been interesting to watch that process take place.
Are you working on another book right now?
Yeah, I'm always working on something. This one was interesting because I didn't expect this book. I'm a poet more than anything else, I think. And so to have the first book be prose-ish or a memoir of some kind was quite surprising. I don't know. I mean, I didn't expect this book, so I shouldn't say that there won't be another one like this one. But the next book will probably be out next year. It's a poetry collection. It's the book that I thought maybe would be the first one, but it's thinking through place and my my living here in Hamilton, right? If Benjamin is thinking through the name and the person and time, this one is maybe maybe not a mirror image, but it's connected in that way, right? It's thinking through place across time as opposed to name or person or identity across time.
Would you like to read some of your work for our listeners?
Yeah, maybe I'll read about my brother. One Saturday morning, when Sam, my brother, was 3 years old, he wandered out of the house. My mom had gone for a walk, and my dad was reading the paper, and I was watching cartoons in the back room, and Sam simply walked out the front door. I remember my dad coming to ask if I had seen Sam. I remember the panic creeping into my parents as it took longer and longer to find him. I remember us and our neighbors out searching, me still in my pajamas. And/or image appears herein because they are part of the Orange County Clerk of Court's official record and are published in accordance with all local and state laws in the state of Florida, USA. Consolidated Charity Chairman Ben Robinson said, "This is our first grants meeting of the year, and we received a large number of applications from a very diverse group of organizations. Ben Robinson, Lucia Hernandez, Eileen Farrell, and Sean Culligan won a grant of €1,000 for their design of a microbit moisture monitor, which involved creating an automatic plant watering system. She is survived by her husband, Gerald William Robinson, whom she married January 10th, 1976. 2 daughters, Nancy Jane Robinson of Litchfield, Illinois, and Gina Dan McCulley of Burns Mill. A brother, Robert F., Michelle Ann, Self Jr. of DeSoto. 8 grandchildren, Emily G., Troy, Long. Eventually, a family of 4 found Sam 2 blocks away and kept him with them until my dad made it that far. When he saw Sam, my dad ran up and hugged him. Once they released, the mother stepped forward, looked my brother in the eye, and asked, 'Is this your dad?'"
Very thought-provoking. Thank you so much for that wonderful reading. Our guest today
You're
has been
welcome.
Ben Robinson, the author of The Book of Benjamin from Palimpsest Press. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you so much, Irene and Kim and Sarah. It's been a joy to be with you.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.